Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am, of course, Josh Bycer, and we have another great cast lineup for you this week. For our discussion, we're going to be talking about accessibility when it comes to the game industry and being able to play video games. And my guest tonight, he is the COO of the charity organization AbleGamers, who have been a strong advocate for improving the ways for people to play and experience video games. And he's on to talk a little bit about the charity, as well as kind of what is the state of game accessibility in today's market. So please welcome to the cast, Steve Spohn. How are you doing, Steve?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you on. And I know this is certainly going to be a very interesting discussion. It's something that I think for a lot of people in the industry, and especially like people like starting to get into it, it's not, I don't think accessibility is something that a lot of people consider, but it is something that I think is growing more and more important, especially with each new year of the game industry.
Yeah, absolutely. When AbleGamers started 15 years ago, it was a taboo subject. It was something that, developers didn't really want to talk about. As a matter of fact, we went to the Game Developers Conference one of the early years of AbleGamers, almost 14 years ago now. The YouTube video still lives on our channel, where we literally asked one question. We said, have you ever thought about designing with disability in mind? And people said predominantly no, a couple of yeses, and one jackwagon laughed at us and walked away.
Ooh.
So, it's come a long way from then, where, people were either not mindful about it or downright disrespectful, to a place where pretty much everybody's thinking about how can we make things accessible.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things we're going to be discussing in our discussion is going to be kind of dispelling some of the myths surrounding accessibility, because as I'm sure you're well aware of, I'm sure my audience is as well, there are certainly a lot of people who don't really understand what it means to make a game more accessible, or just about accessibility in game design in general.
The thing about accessibility is that it's varied person to person, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have the same disability, two different people, it could develop in two completely different ways, because we don't all live the same lives. So, manifesting challenges on one person might not be the same that come about for someone else, whether that's due to nature, whether it's due to nurture. It's a fact of disabilities. We're all unique, even if we can be labeled with the same disability. It's all very, very different depending on what you're dealing with. So I personally have a disability called spinal muscular atrophy, which essentially makes my muscles grow weaker and weaker over time. It's the sister disability to Stephen Hawking's ALS. It is a terminal condition, and before it gets me, I have a lot of video gaming left to do, right? So how do I keep gaming? Well, for me, accessibility is all about being able to use my mouse and a really cool technological hat on my head. But for someone else who has SMA, it might be a trackball. It might be a controller with slightly easier to push buttons. And from the hardware aspect, that's always, something that can vary person to person. And that's only if you have the software options in the game that can provide accessibility for the level that you need it to be. For example, if a game cannot come up to the level of mouse sensitivity that I need, which is really high, I use a 16,000 DPI mouse, then I won't be able to play your game, no matter how accessible it is, because the mouse, if you limit it to, say, 10, then I'm not going to be able to use it. So, it's all about like individual preference, and it's all about figuring out what options work. And that's why AbleGamers in the last couple of years has moved away from a checklist of, well, an accessible game is A, B, and C, to instead figuring out how to develop with accessibility in mind.
And as you said a few minutes ago, with just how much things have, we've seen that shift happen over like the last decade. and there's certainly a lot to discuss. So, my first question, this is one for the people who are listening to us right now who may have not heard of AbleGamers. Could you talk a little bit more about what the charity is and what do you offer for people?
Yeah, Gamers is a 501c3 nonprofit charity creating opportunities that enable play in order to combat social isolation, foster inclusive communities, and improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. And that's generally giant lawyer speak for we help people to connect to one another utilizing the power of video games. How we do that is simple. Our peer support provides one on one guidance to assess players that need controllers or apparatus in order to play video games. And then if you are financially in need, we just give that to you free of charge, thanks to our wonderful donors. We have community development programs, which help foster opportunities for camaraderie to forge lifelong friendships. Player research, which is where you see a lot of the cool statistics coming from Able Gamers, like the fact that there's more than 42 million potential players with disabilities in America alone, over 6 million in Canada, and the number goes up from there. Our engineering department creating multiple new controllers that were not out on the market for various disability types and for people who needed special adaptations. They're pretty much the geniuses that come up with all the hardware. And then we have our professional development side, and that's pretty much where things like our accessible player experiences program live, where we essentially teach developers how to design with accessibility in mind.
Great. And giving developers advice about accessibility, that's definitely going to be a major part for our discussion tonight. So, with that said, I want to spend a few minutes kind of talking about, I guess, where accessibility talks have gone, or where they started from when you first started with Able Gamers, and where they are now, as well as dispelling some of the myths and not so accurate information about what it means to make games accessible for today's developers. So, I guess my first question is: you already said a few minutes ago about kind of when you first appeared, like at a interview or at a conference, and the developers just had like no idea what was happening. For people listening to us recorded, what is like the scene today? Like, have things become more receptive to discussing accessibility for today's gamers?
Yeah, things are looking very much up from where they used to be. Long ago at that GDC conference, most people hadn't thought about accessibility, and some who had just plain old, just didn't respect the fact that people with disabilities wanted to play. But, predominantly nowadays, things have changed where I have probably, I would say, almost every single publisher at this point in one of our inboxes asking us for either support with the game or to engage in dialogue about, what the game is coming out for them that they need help with, or what accessibility options could be better utilized. Generally speaking, I would say overall, uh, accessibility is way above where it was. I mean, we just had, The Last of Us 2 come out with its, gazillion accessibility options, which was fantastic. I think that part of what we need to keep in mind during these conversations is that things have gotten better. But it's kind of like any other social issue out there, right? It's not a drop the flag on the airship carrier and say we did it, job
Mm-hmm.
done. It's not an end goal that's just achievable and then you put a stamp on it and you go on. It's a mindset, it's a change. It is really, honestly, it's changing an entire culture of a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's why it took so long to do. So while things are better, I think they always have room to continue to grow. For example, Nintendo is very not good at accessibility. I have taken them to task personally on Twitter more than once. Able Gamers has never really been able to engage with them because I don't know why, but they just have not been interested. And
Mm-hmm.
I it's a shame because there are a lot of gamers with disabilities out there who would very much like to enjoy the IPs and worlds of Nintendo, and yet for some people they still can't interact with those IPs. So,
Hmm.
it's one of those things where it's fantastic that the industry is coming along, but we are far from done in this battle.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that takes me to my next question, because it's something that I'm sure people listening have wondered. I'm sure it's something that a lot of critics have brought up as well. And that is, what does it mean to make a video game accessible? As you said a few minutes ago, like, everyone is different in terms of how they're able to experience video games, what could possibly trouble them. And I'm sure there are some people out there who think, oh, if you're just talking about accessibility, that just means having subtitles and colorblind mode. And as you said, we just say mission accomplished, we're done.
Yeah.
But like, when people come to you and come to AbleGamers looking to learn more or to develop their game to be more accessible, what I guess what does that mean, like, for a developer listening to us, like, in terms of what they should be thinking about and what they should be putting into their game?
That was one of the crowning achievements we've done in the last couple of years, and that's saying something because Able Gamers gotten in the news quite a bit over the last couple of years. Right now, if you go to accessible.games, that is the website, accessible.games, you can check out a developer resource that we put out for free into the world called Accessible Player Experiences, or APX. And it is an entire myriad of information, design patterns galore, all right, for both input and output on what makes a game a game. So we're talking things like the ability to have clear text, the ability to have improved precision, the ability to have flexible displays and controllers, the ability to bypass things or slow things down, or simply having a training ground where you can learn how to use buttons. Those are all accessibility things that
Hmm.
some people might have seen as accessibility and some people might not. They may have thought they were just game features. And on each and every one of these areas that you can click on, it'll tell you the design pattern behind it. So examples from games where you can find out what it is we're talking about, what the challenge is, what the potential solution is. Because at the end of the day, Able Gamers is not a development company. We are
Hmm.
not developers. We are not coders. We are not people who have ever made a game, right?
Hmm.
Our job in this world is to make things better for people with disabilities. So that's our realm of expertise. So we provide the experience of what a disabled person might go through in order to try to play a video game. And that's really what the information there is all about, so that people can peruse that and find out what it's like to be a disabled person playing games. From there, we have a certified course. It's called the APXP, and it's the Accessible Player Experiences Practitioner course. So, for a couple of $100, you basically can come to Able Gamers virtually, learn on a 2-day class everything that we know about designing with accessibility in mind. And at the end of the third half day, we give you a test. And if you pass it, then you get to get a certificate. It's fully authorized that says you know your stuff when it comes to accessibility. You know as much as Able Gamers does. And currently, there are 114 accessible practitioners out there at major studios like Blizzard, Activision, King, who
Hmm.
have said very very nice things about us and our course on Twitter. And of course, there's a bunch of other ones I'm not allowed to say because of NDAs and whatnot. But suffice it to say, every class has been filling up, and so for those developers out there, listening, if you're thinking about would accessibility help my career moreover than just the right thing to do, absolutely. Studios are out there looking for people who know accessibility, who can fill these roles, because right now it's a void in a lot of studios where they don't have people who understand accessibility. So they're trying to find people who do.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think it's something else that a lot of critics will often bring up. And if you look obviously on Twitter and you see trolls posting about this, that they'll often say, who cares about accessibility features? Why do you care about somebody else wanting to play a game like Dark Souls or, Devil May Cry or, any game that is designed to be like more skill intensive or be a very, I guess, quote unquote, like exclusive experience, something that's meant for higher core players. So when you hear those comments, or if you've seen them, like, what's your response? Like, when people are trying to kind of like gatekeep along those lines?
Well, unfortunately, you see this a lot, particularly in communities like Sekiro, where it's all about that hardcore mentality,
Mm-hmm.
and people start to base a part of their personality, a part of their confidence, is based on the fact that they can beat this very difficult game, and others can't, and that becomes a point of pride for them. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a dangerous thing. I don't love the term slippery slope, but this is one applicable area in that, you're talking about a video game here. It's not actually life or death. If
Mm-hmm.
you have an option in a video game that allows you to play, and then other people need different options, there's no harm to you in them having a different way to play the same video game. Um, my good friend Corey Barlog from over in the God of War area of the world once said very vocally on Twitter in a response to my fighting these trolls that accessibility has never and will never compromise his creative vision. And he vehemently defended me in one of those arguments because the developers themselves have no interest in these trolls talking about how accessibility is ruining games. They want people to be able to play games. They want as many people to enjoy their work as humanly possible. So why would they want to purposely gatekeep? Well, the problem is that some people think that an accessibility option that makes the game easier or makes it more accessible to people who need certain options to make fights a little less daunting, that they're not experiencing it the way the developers intended, even if the developers themselves are saying it's fine. And that's where it's dangerous. Is sometimes fans get overly passionate about a game and they sort of take it on as a life of their own. And you know, you appreciate that in a lot of ways. You appreciate passionate fans, but you also have to keep in mind when the developers themselves are saying, it's not a problem to add accessibility, that it's not something you should be trolling about. It's not something that should be a factor in your Twitter wars or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I have talked ad nauseum in many, many interviews and podcasts about the Sekiro debacle and how, people can just be so mean about, keeping out others. And so I've kind of come to this bullet point of how to figure out if something is fair, right? And this is what I tell
Mm-hmm.
developers nowadays. I say, if you have only two paths to solving a problem, one, where if you allow an option, then I can play and you can play and we both can play the game, but you'll have to understand that my way of playing might be a little different. Or you can not allow one of those two to play the game, but you'll keep it quote unquote pure with no options and no differences in the game, and everybody has the same experience. Which way is more fair? Eliminating the way that some people need to play so that everybody has to play the same way, or allowing people to play different ways. And most people will come to the conclusion that you're better off allowing people to play the way that they have to rather than the way they want to. And so if I have to play with,
Mm-hmm.
monsters only doing half damage because I can't move away fast enough, my reflexes can't be trained, they can't go more.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the limitation of my physicality. Then that's not my fault. I was just born that way. So it's okay to lean on an option and understand that it might be just as hard for me as it is for you, even though the difficulty settings are on different levels.
Again, I think this is where things get like very interesting and can often be very complicated for people who don't understand like game design or understand accessibility. Like going back to what you said a few minutes ago about everything from having, font sizes and being able to adjust them to a tutorial section. Like there's a lot of aspects that are just kind of either that are like inherently ingrained in game design that are accessible, and there's also elements that are more about, user experience, onboarding that would also fit into this.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've said, there is no such thing as that one size fits all, that if you do A through E, your game is perfectly accessible to everyone. And to compound that, every genre itself has its own unique wrinkles and its own elements that you have to keep track of.
Absolutely, yeah. They're not all as easy as one another. I mean, just in general speaking, fighting games and driving games and platforming games tend to be a little more on the inaccessible side because of the reflexes and twitch actions that you have to take. Whereas things like a first person shooter are often accessible because of how many options are put into the game on a base level, just trying to make the game comfortable for players, that they accidentally make it accessible to a lot of people. So, at the same time, the inverse is completely true for some gamers with disabilities. Some can play a racing game really, really easy, but couldn't play a shooting game if you paid them money. Like it's just the way that the gaming works, in that all the genres are different and they all have their own set of complications.
Mm-hmm. And when I look at, like, for a lot of the games that I play, especially from the independent space, that a lot of them, like, typically lack in terms of accessibility, whether it's due to the design, making a very experimental or unique game, or simply just not having, the thoughts or the kind of the background understanding UI and UX. And it is kind of frustrating when I see this, because when we're trying to, or like for a lot of the stuff that I do with Game Wisdom, it's about trying to improve the foundation of how a game is played. And I guess it does seem, I want to get your thoughts on this, that for a lot of people, it's still very hard to kind of understand, you know, is there a limit on how far someone should make their game accessible? As we've said, it's hard to put your finger down on what exactly makes a game accessible versus making it inaccessible. But for a lot of people, I think they still have trouble understanding, if I put key rebindings, is that a big deal for my game or something like that?
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a valid point. Where do you draw the line between, this is common and this is asking a lot? And I think the truth of that is that bar moves depending on what studio you are. If you're an independent with a limited budget, or you're an independent with a large budget. Is your game selling really well and you want to reinvest some of that money into coding? Did you put some early money into the game development cycle to make it accessible from the ground up? That determines where that bar is. So
Mm-hmm.
there's some things we take now for absolutes, right? When you think about gaming, what are a couple of things that you can think of right off the top of your head? Well, most of you are going to say closed captioning. That is an accessibility feature. It was not an accessibility feature until the movie industry started taking flack from the disability rights groups that were saying, you're leaving us out of movies. We can't enjoy them. And then that carried over into other genres, including television and video games. So we have the movie industry and the disability advocates that pushed for that to be an almost law compliance thing, which there are things in video games that are hedging that way as well. We talk about remapping keys, so not every game has the ability to remap every button to everything, but predominantly they do. I would
Mm-hmm.
say 9 out of 10 games now, I'm looking at the audience here, whether or not you agree, you're probably shaking your head going, yeah, pretty much. And that's about right. There are some that don't do remappable keys, but it's pretty rare. And even the ones that don't usually say, yeah, we're going to do that eventually. We just haven't gotten to it yet. So those are accessibility features. So what is it? that draws the line between am I asking too much? Well, I think independents are actually one of the greatest data points we have for what is an easy ask, right?
Hmm.
If I am having problems accessing a game, or if I have, someone who comes to AbleGamers and says, hey, I can't play this game because of this reason, et cetera, et cetera. Can you do something about that? And I'll reach out to, say, an EA. I may have to go through 5 different people,
Hmm.
even though I have contacts over there, before I can actually get them to make a change, because it's got to go to the accessibility person, then it's got to go
Hmm.
to the team, then it's got to get approved, then it's got to get run through Q&A, then it's got to do a bug report, then it's got to get put in a patch. If you reach out to an indie who they are the entire department, then you can say, hey, I need the mouse speed turned up to 10. Can you do that? They go, yeah, sure. And then 2 days later, it's in the game. So, indies are often fantastic when it comes to adding accessibility. That really doesn't take a lot. Because most accessibility is not expensive. Most accessibility is just plotting ways around potential problems. So, our advice to people from AbleGamers is always put in as much accessibility as you can without taxing yourself a lot. If you can put in 6 options, fantastic. That's 6 more options than the game had before. Don't stop there. Keep adding them, but you got to start somewhere. So you don't need to add in 62 options right off the bat. If you can only add, say for 5 patterns on accessible.games, great. Those are 5 more things that people will be able to add. And those are 5 more groups of people that will be able to come in and play games. These are the kind of things you need to work on. It's just think of it as chipping away at, a Rubik's Cube where you're just lining things up slowly over time. Eventually, you'll get the whole thing.
Hmm. And what you said there, I think I want to kind of expand on for developers listening about kind of the expensive side of this or the lack of it. Because I'm sure
Yeah.
this is something a lot of people think about. I'm sure this could also be a really interesting myth when it comes to accessibility. That, it's very expensive to try and, change my game along these lines. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that for developers listening. Like, does it or is there a lot of difficulty in some of the aspects of trying to make a game more accessible?
It's one of those things where, again, it depends. Is your game in Unix or Unity? Is it a try to combine Linux and Unity there? Is it in a Unity game? Is it on the Unreal Engine? Is it on Java? Are we talking about a game that you came up with in Game Development Studios? Uh, what kind of game did you make? And then how much accessibility is baked into the program or the engine that you use to create your game? And then from there, you got to figure out, well, here's the things that other games in my genre have had. So if you're designing a, isometric top-down puzzle, game, maybe you're going to want to look to see what other isometric puzzle games have done along the way, and then go, okay, well, they did these 5 accessibility things, we should probably do that too. What else could go wrong? Okay, accessibility dot games. Let's see. Okay, we should also put in the ability to undo and redo. If someone makes the wrong move in the puzzle, they should be able to go back and do that again. And you kind of go through that, and you start to learn to think about things as opposed to, you know oh man, this game doesn't have enough accessibility. You start thinking of it as, okay, well, this game has, say, do more with less. Okay, great. So what does that mean? Well, that means in development language that you're able to do more than one button press by only putting one input. So instead of having to push, A, B, and C on the keyboard, you're able to put that together and do that in A, reducing the number of key presses that you need to
Hmm.
use. And those kind of things can be very, very cheap, very not costly. Now, sometimes it can cost time, and as we all know, time is money. Uh, but the thing is, with such a big niche, quote unquote, of accessibility, you're not talking about 100 people who want to play games, you're talking about tapping into a potential 42 million people just in America. What developer out there listening to your show, or even the ones who are out there and are busy making their games and don't have time for podcasts, which of those are gonna hear, oh, you have 42 million people and maybe I can get a percentage of those? Nah, not worth my time. Well, very, very few are gonna turn their nose up at 42 million, right?
Hmm.
So, you gotta think to yourself, it's not only the morally right thing to do, but there is a strong business case to be made. Again, our research wing of AbleGamers comes up with some amazing statistics on this kind of stuff. And the one of the presentations that we've done around was by Dr. Chris Power, our VP of AbleGamers, and in his presentation, he was saying that there are literal billions with a B, not M, with a B, of disposable income from the disability community that can go towards video games. Because if you're trapped in your house, if you have a mind that's willing and a body that's unable, maybe you want to play video games as your escapism. Maybe that's how you get away from pain. Maybe that's how you connect with your friends and loved ones. These are all perfectly valid reasons to spend $19.99 on a video game, right? So
Hmm.
let people spend the money on your game as a way to do the things that they need to do. And so if you're making a game that has some options in it, some accessibility in it, and it's something that you want to cater towards, then you're actually doing well for your business as well. So it's one of those dual sides, right? You can make a business side case for it, you can make a morality case for it, but no matter how you're looking at it, spending the time on accessibility will enable more people to join your game.
And as you said, there is certainly a huge market for this. And some of the examples that you brought up, such as being able to combine command inputs to a single button, like that's not only accessibility, that's also a really solid quality of life or UX element.
Yes.
And a lot of, I think, what we see and why these discussions are so important is that it really just comes down to being able to improve these video games and make them, like, if you can make your game accessible, it's going to help not only a larger group of people, but it kind of helps you improve at your own game design. As somebody who plays so many independent games, like, I can always spot when I'm playing a game from somebody who's either a novice or a first timer that their games are often very clunky to play. And the problem with that is if you're not able to kind of look beyond why somebody is having trouble experiencing your game or wanting to play it, it's only going to doom your game in the greater market trying to get it out there for people to play it in the first place.
Yep, absolutely true. When I was at the Penny Arcade East, no, this is what, 6 years ago now. It feels like forever ago in the before times. There was this incident that happened. We were on a panel, and Able Gamers was giving out an Accessible Game of the Year award. It was just something nice that we wanted to do, maybe to give a nod. You know how all these award shows are out, and the Game Awards had just begun becoming a thing, and we wanted to sort of add accessibility since nobody was doing it. And we started handing out this award, and we gave it to Star Wars: The Knights of the Old Republic, the MMO version of Star Wars,
Hmm.
and basically said, you guys and gals and non-binary pals did great. Congratulations on doing this really, really well. And the the feedback that I got live on the panel with the head developer was, oh well, we didn't really do this to be accessible. It's just good game design. The fact that it was accessible was an accident. So, I don't know that we really deserve this. And, this guy was kind of acting like this because obviously his studio told him to be there. He obviously didn't want to be there.
Hmm.
And anybody who knows who I am knows I'm really quick to push back on stuff like this. And I was like, Well, sir, the problem is good game design is accessible design.
Mm-hmm.
So what you call a quality of life improvement may be the only reason that I can play a game. So if we're both accomplishing the same goal of making our games easier and better to play, I don't see why that doesn't deserve recognition. And he was kind of speechless at that and kind of got a little bit grumpy with me and for calling him out, I'm live on the panel. But what he was saying was, in my opinion, at the time, damaging. To put down accessibility as not important was frustrating to me, especially when you're talking about quality of life improvements. Like, who doesn't love when a game, in any game, allows you to push one button to loot all the items instead of having to push the button 19 times? Who doesn't love
Mm-hmm.
it whenever you can turn in a quest by just right clicking on the NPC and then going through the text and reading what happened instead of having to go through a catalog of different buttons to turn in the quest?
Mm-hmm.
These are just improvements that over the years we've decided we as a gaming community like. Think about games that were designed, think about Diablo and how clunky Diablo the original is compared
Mm-hmm.
to Diablo 3, right? So, and it's just something that we've kind of gotten used to, is the smoothness of games. Now things feel very flowy in video games. Like you were saying, some of them you can tell a first time game developer hasn't exactly figured out how to make that feel flowy yet. And, they will eventually, of course. But in the beginning, it's just about quality of life improvements. So I think that a lot of things can be said for the old golden rules of just making things better for everyone. Sometimes by trying to make things a little more convenient for some, you're making it accessible to another.
And as we've said, we've seen this growth over the past decade, and it's fascinating, I think, to see how much people are really starting to pay attention to this. And kind of like from my perspective, like the first thing that I saw, that at least from here, that it was like a big deal, was the accessibility controller that Microsoft put out. And I think that was what, in 2019, 2018, I forget. And that was kind of like this huge moment. I know a few people who I follow on Twitter who like worked on it or who provide advice to Microsoft in terms of getting that and making it readily available for everyone.
Yeah, I think having things available to a wider audience is a privilege, right?
Hmm.
So when you're talking about having hardware or software that's out there in the world and now being enjoyed by this large swath of people, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't want your product to be among uh, the ones that are being developed not just for a niche but to just generally make things a more inclusive and welcoming community. I mean, I think anyone who's listening to this broadcast would like to agree that we all want to think of gamers as good people, right? We're all people who are trying to just have fun with one another. And so having the ability to have that on a more mass market scale just makes sense to continue furthering the narrative that despite what some politicians say, gamers are not bad people, we're loving people.
Hmm. So, few questions I want to kind of ask about kind of like where things are at in terms of
Yeah.
accessibility. So, the first one, earlier in the cast, you mentioned The Last of Us 2 as being like one of the more better examples of video game accessibility. Are there any other recent or maybe not so recent examples of a game that kind of went above and beyond in terms of being very accessible to a wide audience that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what your definition of above and beyond is. For me, as someone who is very, very
Mm-hmm.
close to video games, and it's honestly my job to keep tabs on what improvements have been made in games, I don't think of things in terms of how many accessible options a game has. I think about what it did to change the game.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, sometimes I get myself in trouble because I'll say, "Yeah, Last of Us 2 was great. I'm glad they did it with all the accessibility options, but it's just one game." And people are like, "Oh my God, Steve! Like it was the best accessibility ever, and you have to praise it." And I'm like, "No, I don't. It's just another game. There is another 5 of them that come out every single week at least. So I can't just hang my hat on one game. I need to look at games that have done something that changed the way that all the rest of them will then do it from that forward. And it's wild how it carries over from one game to another. Let me give you an example that I think might speak to your developer audience, as well as just the gamers listening. So whether or not you enjoy battle arenas, we all know that the battle arena is here to stay. It will not go away, no matter how many times we wish it would. It everyone thing has a battle arena mode now, right? So some people get sick of it, some people love it. No matter whether you love it or hate it, it has borne out some very good accessibility features. For example, in PlayerUnknown Battleground, they have a very modular design, which Fortnite would go on to copy, where when you are piloting your parachute down to the ground from the plane, you have buttons and inputs that do one thing. And then as soon as you're on the ground, those same buttons do another thing. And then as soon as you go to get in a car, those same buttons do another thing. And that was unheard of before PUBG. There was not modular design. There was not the ability to use the same 4 to 6 buttons for literally everything in the game. You had to be like, all right, well, for driving the car, it's going to be WSD, and then we're going to need these buttons over here for the rockets, and But PUBG changed that, and then Fortnite adopted that, and then from there it went on to be in other games like Celeste, and so it started crossing genres, and it started going into different games of different types, and that kind of game-changing input structure is really what I pay attention to. It's I can name games like Celeste as great because they were great for accessibility, but really it's all about how things have moved the needle on accessibility and what makes us more excited. For example, in Forza there is an option that you can turn on that puts an arrow on the track. And as long as that arrow is turned on, it's called driving assist. Basically, all you have to do is hit gas and brake. You don't really have to steer. Your car will stay magnetized to this arrow that changes colors between red and green, depending on how fast you're going. And it essentially turns a driving game into a 2-button game. And that had never been done before they decided to do it. And now I have seen that feature in everything from first-person shooting story games to on-the-rails story co-ops to some battle arenas. It's even in Uncharted and Far Cry. I mean, where you literally can just turn this feature on and your car will drive from one point to another. And, some people don't want it and they don't have to. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier. Having those options in there are fantastic because maybe in Far Cry you like to drive around and roll over some people and have fun shooting and all that. But for me, driving the vehicle is very, very difficult, while running around and shooting people is not. So if I can have the video game drive me from point A to point B, and then I can jump out and shoot, well, then I can still play the game. So in that option enables it where we both can play. We both can enjoy the game however we want to, separately, but together.
And for myself and for my audience listening, they know I become a very big stickler when it comes to UI and UX in a video game.
Yeah.
And for me, every time a game annoys me or frustrates me like that, I just think about how many seconds or compound to minutes of these annoyances being built up. And it's oftentimes the main reason why I stop playing a video game. If it just frustrates me so much to be able to control it, why should I continue to give this game the time of day? And this is coming from somebody, again, for people listening, I play a lot of hardcore games. I have played all the From Software games. I've played Doom. The only thing that I typically avoid are like the Battle Royale games because I'm not a huge multiplayer person. But like this is coming from somebody who plays these games. Like, and you would think like a super hard boss, I'll bang my head against the wall for hours to beat it. The fact that I can't quickly swap out my inventory or I can't rebind keys, that's the straw that broke the camel's back and why I stopped playing a game.
Yeah, and it honestly it should be, and that's what I had mentioned earlier about the difference, and the From Software games are where I hit into the largest resistance, and it's to me it's very puzzling, to be honest with you, because if you talk to some of those fans, they will say things like, oh, well, I don't want there to be an easier mode because then everybody will just do that and my achievement will mean nothing. And that's not true. Like, just because there's an option in the game to make something easier or give you more lives or whatnot, like, that doesn't take away from what you want to do. You like to do a game that you have to bang your head against a wall for 4 hours to beat, right? Because once you beat it, it feels really good, right? You got that adrenaline, you got that satisfaction. Hell yeah, I did it, right? So, that feeling, that can be from beating a boss. That can be from beating a boss where the boss only has 10% of the same hit points, but it gives me the same feeling because I also had to beat my head against the wall for 4 hours in order to get that done. And for me, that was the achievement. And that's something that I think is one of the hardest things to communicate. I think about that a lot in first person shooters, where your viewpoint on it um, changes the paradigm very much. So let's say that to somebody listening, they love first person shooters and, they go in and they when they're having a bad day, they only kill, 5 to 1, and that's their bad days. On a good day, maybe if you're a disabled gamer, your good days are killing one person for every time you die. Maybe your KD is just down to 1. Maybe that's a good day for you. Well, if you're having fun and I'm having fun and, I kill less than you, who cares? As long as we're both enjoying it. And that's what I think sometimes these conversations go a little bit off the rails. I know, particularly for a show like yours, it's a little bit more about the technical aspect of it. But for me, it's always, video games are here to give us some sort of satisfaction, whether that's entertainment, whether that's education, whether that's a sense of purpose or achievement. As long as that's what you're getting out of the game, who really cares if you and I have to play a little bit differently? As long as we're both getting the same feeling out of it, that's all that should matter.
Yeah. And I think that's even how some of my thoughts have changed. Because I remember, like, 15 years ago, like, writing pieces saying, Dark Souls doesn't need a difficulty feature. Or I think one thing that I remember I wrote that I think I still regret was saying, Nintendo doesn't need to add in, the assist mode. That if you die too many times in a Mario level, that it gives, infinite invincibility or just makes things a lot easier for you. And I have come back, I think, from that. I think a lot of that has just been experiencing so many games and seeing that not every game is, the perfect, everyone can play this game, why change anything? It's perfect the way it is. And as you said earlier, it's really about moving that needle and making these improvements that can then be adopted and kind of, flourish all around the industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting back to what you were talking about earlier with the course that you offer for game developers, so like to come in and learn about accessibility. Something that I'm curious about, and I'm sure this is something my audience would be very interested in as well. Are there any like areas where developers like coming in, like if they have like no experience with accessibility or they're new, like anything that they commonly struggle with, or like is there like a metaphorical wall that they have to get around, like they kind of like stops them at the beginning?
I think it's all about your perspective. So, um, would you say that, you know, you wanted to learn more about the gamer side or the developer side? Because I think that's two different angles.
I would say from the developer side.
So the developer side, what primarily stops someone from enjoying one of the games is those frustration points that you were talking about, where they don't necessarily understand what accessibility is, and it was an education problem. It was something that we really had to go through, where we had to teach developers what accessibility was and why they should care about it. And then there was this huge fear in the industry that we were policing them, that we were saying, "Oh, your game is bad. You shouldn't play it." Like, it's the barrier became that we were the people at the nightclubs walking around waiting to beat people in the head, and it took us a good couple of years to eventually teach the developers that we're not here to tell you that you're doing things wrong, that you're crappy for being a developer. No, we're on your side. We want to tell you, like, hey, it turns out Billy needs this adaptation to your game that'll probably take you about, I don't know, $300 to do, where some developers' time. If you could do that, then that'd be great. Then a bunch of people like Billy can play the game. Wouldn't that be cool? And then as soon as they realized that, it was all great. It was all, it was a thing where they were able to game. And I think that was a huge barrier in the very beginning. I think that stopped a lot of people from even trying accessibility, because they felt like they had failed before they had even started, right? So I think that's something that really had to be worked out for, and trying to figure out where these things fit in, because and I tell you honestly, I still to this day don't know where it started from, but somebody out there began the myth that game accessibility is super expensive, and I to this day I have not been able to figure out why people think that it takes oodles and oodles of money. Like, even if you design to the most highest of accessibility levels, we're not talking about an investment of $100 billion, and I have yet to really figure out why that myth kind of got out there. It wasn't something that I ever really found a source for. It just seemed to be prevalent as just I'd like to do that, but that's probably expensive, so we can't.
And I love what you just said about how, like, people sound like, they think that you're policing or you're harassing them because you point out these issues. And, I get that with some of the stuff that I talk about. When I do my design piece and I talk about a game, like, someone will say, "Oh, you just hate this game. You're attacking the developers because you didn't like it." Or, you're claiming that they are inferior because you gave this game a low review score. I'm like, no, I'm just talking about the design. Like, that's what we're focusing on. And I think what you said earlier about how people get so, caught up in their own, like, self-esteem being tied to a property, to a fandom, to a video game, I think it causes these issues and these misconceptions.
It does, and I think that is something that we continue to need to look out for, right? I think that whether it's talking about reviews, or whether it's the misconception of being the cops and the robbers, it needs to be refocused into a discussion point of wanting to make the product the best it can be. Because what's happened is there are trolls out there that just want to make things a nightmare for people, whether that's individuals, whether that's the press, whether that's reviewers, whether that's the game devs themselves. And so they'll use reviews as an attack tool, to one-star bomb because they don't like something one of the devs did or said. Or they'll use, the accessibility as like you're a bad company, you should be canceled. And those are the ones that always kind of boggle my mind, because there's, number one, it's damaging to all communities involved, but trolls will be trolls. We all know that they're a painful part of life. But we need to be very cognizant of the fact that there are reviews and there are people who are out there trying to make it a better place. So let's take the example of about 3 months ago now. A developer for Dead by Daylight was on Twitch, and one of their users asked them while they were streaming if they would be implementing a colorblind mode anytime soon because they really needed it in order to be able to play, that they couldn't enjoy the game. And the dev basically responded with, oh, geez, another person asking me about colorblind. Yada, yada, yada. I know, colorblind. You want it. We've heard you. We know. We'll get to it when we feel like it.
Mm.
And that was a super inappropriate answer. And so when someone brought it to my attention, I looked into it and I discovered that, yes, this was a developer. Yes, he was out of line. And I retweeted tagging the company and saying, hey, it's not really cool that he's saying this, but are you paying attention to the fact that the community is asking for this? Because it'd be fantastic if you were working on some designs to be able to make accessibility in Dead by Daylight. And within a couple hours, they were responding. The internet was, retweeting like mad and, doing what the internet does. And so I've gotten pretty good at using my platform to get attention to causes like this. And they got back and they said, oh yeah, actually we weren't going to reveal this yet, but here's some screenshots for the upcoming colorblind patch that we're going to do. We have heard the community, and we're not sure why this developer responded that way. Maybe they were having a bad day, PR mitigation. But basically saying, whoops, shouldn't have done that. But we are going to make the game better. And in that, it wasn't me calling the internet to go dogpile on this guy and run him out of the entertainment business and, ruin his credit score. It was Dead by Daylight is a fun game, and I would love to see it be able to include people who are colorblind or need other accessibility. I know from personal experience, I have to hack the INI files in Dead by Daylight to make the mouse go as fast as I need it to because they capped it too low. And so, I know for a fact that there are things they could do very easily to make the game more accessible. And I wish that they would, and I think they're starting to. So that is how you use, reviews, and how you use the internet to do good is you draw attention to the problem, you point out the negative, and then you say, okay, here's what I'd like it to do better. And what we need to realize as a society, from this very long-winded point of mine, is that we need to start learning the difference between when somebody is trolling and trying to get a rise out of other people and just trying to make trouble, and when you're pointing out a flaw and you're critiquing it because you want it to get better, not because you want it to fail.
Yep, and that is definitely an important lesson for any developers listening that you need to learn, especially when it comes to play testing and user feedback. Because as you said, like with the Dead by Daylight example, that if a lot of people in your community want X, doing X will make them happier, make them want to support you. They're not bugging you because they hate your game, they don't want to play it. They want to be able to play your game. And and again, like from like a a marketing or just like more the manage or the production side, if you can make your game, more accessible and get more people to buy it, well, there's a chance you're going to earn more money, which means your game does better.
Absolutely. We need to reach a point where we're understanding of who it is that we're dealing with, not just the subject matter. Look into what it is that you're getting that feedback on. Is somebody giving you valid feedback that, in fact, your game does need a little bit more accessibility, or it's somebody who is in pain because they just want to play your game and they can't? Or is it somebody who is just trying to troll you and make some lulls by making your day worse? You need to sort of determine that, and then once you determine that they're not a bad faith actor, then take some action. If you can make your game better, make it a little bit better. If you can add the accessibility the person's adding easily, then try to take the time to do that, because you're only going to add more people who are going to play your game or buy your game if you add that accessibility, as we've already talked about. So it's really about figuring out what are the real motives behind why somebody is creating this fuss for you. Is it because they're frustrated and they want to play your game? Or is it because they actually just want to get the lulz?
Mm-hmm. So, like speaking about Dead by Daylight and like other games that have a competitive edge to them, I think this is another aspect where we see kind of accessibility discussions run into trouble, and that is when it comes down to player versus player content. But as we said earlier, with gamers and people, getting their identity connected to the games they play, that is very much like at the core of a lot of competitive and esports level games where anything that can make the game easier to play or can give somebody even a slight advantage is often looked at as completely breaking the balance of the game at the competitive level. And
Right.
earlier you mentioned, of course, fighting games, and I know the fighting game genre for the longest time has been very slow in terms of trying to make them more accessible and more approachable to a larger audience. Like, I think the example that comes into my head would be, like, as an example of something on the positive side, would have been something like Mortal Kombat 11, which, was like the first time in the franchise that had, like, this really solid tutorial to teach people how to play it. And, like, again, like, a lot of what we talk about is, like, at its most basic level, just good UI UX design. And it took them, what, like, almost, like, the 25, 30 years to actually start trying to make that a part of their game.
Yeah, and let's face it, fighting games are sort of, one of the foundational archetypes of video games, right? We've been doing those ever since Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter were
Mm-hmm.
back on the original consoles and probably drawn on paper at some point. So of course we want them to be accessible, just like all the other games. And there is some difficulty in that. Um, in fact, so much so that one of the items that you learn in the accessible player experiences course is a workshop on designing a fighting game that is accessible. And the reason that we put it in there is because we want people to know that it is possible to do that. And how you do that can be a little challenging. You can receive pushback from players who think that you shouldn't be able to say push one button to execute a fatality or something like that. And I think that's where a lot of the advantage of being both a single player and a multiplayer game come from. Having one set of options that can be deployed for single player use versus having options that are for all day use for PvP or tournament purposes. I think those are very important distinguishing characteristics to make. I was doing an interview actually earlier today in which someone was asking me about tournaments and how do you make those fair for people with disabilities and able-bodied people alike. And the truth is that it's a sticky wicket. It is not an easy thing to do. If it was,
Mm-hmm.
then everyone would already be doing them. So you have to figure out how is it fair.
Mm-hmm.
How is it fair to be able to do certain accessibility options and how is it not? So I think that there's a couple of different levels to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Take for example an argument that I got into with Jeff Kaplan a couple of times when we were talking about Overwatch. He was a big opponent to a device called a Zim. A Zim is a small adaptation device that allows you to plug a keyboard and a mouse into a console.
Mm-hmm.
And he was pretty much calling this a cheat, in that because if you plug in a keyboard and mouse, you can have superior aiming ability than someone who's using a joystick and doesn't have the same precision. because you can use your whole hand instead of just your thumb.
Yeah.
So, my response to him was, okay, so here's what you're telling me. And again, this goes back to the option A and option B thing I talked about earlier. Option A, you can eliminate the Zim so that anyone who needs the Zim is unable to play, and then everyone has to use a controller, and if they can't use a controller, oh well, but at least the people who can use the controller are all on an even playing field. Or you could B, keep the Zim in the software or in the hardware of the system, and anybody who is that bothered by it can go buy a keyboard and mouse if they're absolutely sure that a keyboard and mouse gives you such a competitive edge that there's no way to win without it. Option A is just the way it is. There's nothing you can do about it. If you're disabled and you want to play and the Zim is knocked out of competition, then too bad for you. You're not playing the game. Option B, I can play with my Zim and enjoy the game, and you too can go buy a Zim if you really feel like it's that much of an advantage, and you can play with one too. So which one of those is more fair?
Yep.
So, that's what it comes down to. At the end of the day, it's deciding what do you consider fair for everybody. If it's kind of like keeping out cheating at a sports event. Obviously you don't want there to be cheating. Obviously you want things to be as fair as possible, but there are a whole entire bunch of branded allowed features. You're allowed to have steel-toed shoes in baseball. Even though it can hit somebody in the groin and take them down. You're allowed to do this. You're allowed to do that, and so each tournament has to decide what's right for them. And unfortunately, it's a giant gray area. And sadly, there isn't really a right and a wrong answer to that. All you can really do is simply say, well, what's the most fair that would fit in the most amount of people? Then that's the best you can do.
So I think with that, I am about out of questions. I'm trying to think if there's anything else from a developer point of view to ask. So while I'm trying to think of anything regarding like AbleGamers in terms of any like major events or fundraisers or anything coming up that you would like to tell people about?
We're coming up on Disability Day, which it's fun. This is why I like to joke about the one day of the year when every company cares about disability. Game Accessibility Awareness Day is May 21st every year, and it's the day that pretty much every company will talk about their uh, improvements to accessibility and what they can do. Um, Outside of that, which is always a great thing when people pay attention, but I kind of am a big proponent of game companies caring during the other 355 days a year. So for those ones, we're always doing cool events. Right now, I've got my own personal event outside of AbleGamers running called Spawn Together, and it's essentially where I'm using the power of the internet to raise $1 million for the charity. And so far, going pretty well. We're up to about 720,000, and that's all from individuals just giving $5 at a time and kind of showing the power. Again, I was talking about gamers being good earlier tonight. Well, gamers are really good people, and they have a lot of power combined together. So, these kind of initiatives are always going on because we're always trying to do more and better, and we have some big dreams. For what we want to do, continuing to offer this course. We have to pay people to teach the course. We have to pay people to do the assessments for people with disabilities and pay for engineers to design the equipment. And unfortunately, as much as everyone would like to work for free, they just can't. So, we're always out there raising awareness and raising funds to continue doing more good. I often said in my early days that we were the only charity that wants to be put out of business, and that's no less true today than it was back then. I wish that I could tell you that one day everything will be so accessible that there won't be a need for Able Gamers or our services. But I think as long as there are people with disabilities, there'll always be bigger milestones we can hit to include people. And part of that is, going on shows like this and talking to developers directly to make an appeal to, whether you're at a studio right now and you have some influence on AAA games, or whether you're developing the next, Stardew Valley that's going to end up being a mega hit. Like, don't forget accessibility. You'll be
Mm-hmm.
locking out a lot of people if you do.
Yep. So here's something that I wanted to ask you about. In
Yeah.
terms of like the hardware side of things, you mentioned several examples over the
Yeah.
course of our cast. Are there any like new or upcoming tech that would be something like interesting for developers to like keep an eye out for in terms of improving accessibility for people?
Yeah, the big one to figure out right now is virtual reality.
Hmm.
It's a hotly contested subject. It is something that we're all trying to figure out right now, and it is quite frankly something that not even AbleGamers has all the answers for yet. Right now, we have come up with a lot of good groundwork on what might make something a little bit more accessible as far as VR goes. But when you come down to it, yeah, there's still this big problem of VR for the most part needs a headset with
Mm-hmm.
the ability to move your neck back and forth and hold two widgets in your hands. And by definition, you are a mostly able-bodied person if you can do all those things. So it it very much goes against the definition of disability, and it's something that we're going to continue to have to keep working on. So we have some very, very smart people who are, working on, what would virtual reality look like if you didn't have the headset and you had, glasses instead,
Mm-hmm.
or, what if instead of holding the wands, maybe, you have something where you can, put something on your arm and move your arm around. Like, things like that are what's going to push the needle on that kind of thing. And it's something that I would tell people to continue to look out for is, you're gonna have to learn how to design your video game with, augmented reality or virtual reality or mobile. There are gonna be challenges, especially as you continue in your career. You figure probably in the next decade, more often than not, there's probably going to be some kind of augmented reality component to games. Yeah, we can already see it with games like Battlefield and Call of Duty that have, those third-party apps that you can log
Mm-hmm.
into from your iPad, where you can, control part of the game as part of the gimmick of the game. So I think this is going to continue to be a thing. And I think we're going to have to look out for technology that not only changes how we play games, but we're going to have to continue to evolve how we accept those inputs into the game so that they're not analog but digital, and we allow less on off of whether a button is being pressed and more you know how hard is this being pressed. And one of the new Xbox
Mm-hmm.
things is there's the pressure sensitivity thing. So I think that we're going to continue to see those kind of things in development where we're going to have to start thinking outside the box as to just what do we want to make be an input, and how hard do we want to push players in order to quote get good.
Mm-hmm. This has certainly been a very fascinating discussion, and again, Steve, I want to thank you for coming on for this.
Well, my pleasure to come by, and I appreciate your time and everyone listening. And hopefully, y'all know a little bit more about accessibility, and it'll be at the forefronts of your minds, or at least as part of your considerations when you're developing, the next mega hit. Just keep in mind that there's a lot of people out there who might play differently than you, but
Mm-hmm.
they want to enjoy life the same as you, and their money spends just as good as yours.
Yeah. And as we've said over the course of this discussion, that a lot of the stuff is inherently built out of UI and UX, and those aspects are universal. And like, I just think again about my own experience with becoming more and more aware of this. That once you get to a point when you're thinking about how somebody experiences a game, it's not something that you can easily turn off. And why, for a lot of the games that I play, especially when I play games that are submitted to me by developers, I am often very quick to point out UI, UX, and accessibility issues. Like my audience, like we joke now about games that don't have volume sliders. Like that right there is like the very first thing that I will mention if a game doesn't have.
Yep.
And again, like I'm sure there's people out there, like as with a lot of the things that we've discussed, will say, "Oh, who cares about volume sliders? Who cares? Just lower the volume of your speakers. Big whoop." But again, with what we've discussed, it's about allowing more people to experience this game. And if you willingly choose to ignore that, you are basically cutting out a huge number of people who would be more than happy to support you. And as you've said, as we've seen, when a game is accessible and a lot of people can experience it, people are going to be more willing to buy it. It's just that simple at that point.
Absolutely.
So, I guess final questions for you for tonight, and then we'll wrap things up. Anything else regarding AbleGamers in terms of what you do, the course, or anything else that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up for the audience?
We pretty much only touched on about 1/5 of what AbleGamers does. We do a lot, and I think, one of the things you talked about, busting myths. I think one of the biggest ones that I know I'm currently waging a huge war on is we've reached this strange part in culture where people are starting to think of accessibility as a fast food menu. Like, you just, if you're a disabled person, you just pull up the Able Gamers and you ask for a number 6 supersized with fries, and this is not the way it works. The things we didn't talk about were things like our peer support and consultation, which is, literally you're talking up to 20 hours with an individual analyzing their desires, their dreams, their challenges, their barriers, and how you bridge the gap between the two. And it's a process. It's something that you have to go through with each individual as they, need help going through the process. So it's definitely something that I think that we continue to work on. I think it's something that I am personally passionate about, is make sure that everybody has the ability to play the way that they need to. And the problem I've always told people is, there's a lot of great causes out there, a lot of great charities, and some of them are really easy to spell out. It's play games, heal sick kids, or raising money for a hospital, or it's a children's hospital that needs helping, and those are all really easy causes to talk about. Whereas there's a lot of nuances to helping people with disabilities, and whether we're talking about the player research, and how there's an entire 500 people with disabilities who are waiting for developers who need assistance in their games and their testers. Our Player Fables program does that, and it's amazing the amount of things that we're able to do at Able Gamers, and you have about a dozen initiatives going on because disability is so wide and so varied, and there's so many different things that we need, and at the end of the day, I can't softball pitch that into a nice, neat sentence for clipping purposes. At the end of the day, as we said in the very beginning of the show, disabilities are varied and different, just like people are. And so we have to offer as many services as we can to get people playing again.
And again, I'm sure, as you just said, there's still so much we can discuss in terms of making games more accessible. And if you or anyone else from the organization wants to come back on for a follow-up cast in the future, definitely feel free to reach out.
Yeah, definitely. We love talking about accessibility, so for sure.
All right. I guess with that, my final question for you then is, for developers listening to us right now who are interested in this or still unsure, do you have like any final comments for them regarding accessibility to kind of end our cast on?
I think if you've listened to us talk about accessibility for the last hour and a half, you're either in or you've fallen asleep by now. But I think at the end of the day, it's really simple. Is accessibility has two ways to look at it, and that is the heartstring way, and that is the money way. And no matter which way you look at it now, I can walk into a boardroom meeting and I can show the business case to a bunch of people who only care about money, or I can talk to developers and I can show them people who want to enjoy their game and why they should care about that. Either way you look at the scenario now, it's the same thing where we are at a point that video game accessibility is so important that you have to believe in it on some level. You may not believe that your particular game needs it. Maybe, you're somebody who is like From Software and doesn't want accessibility options in your game. And if so, then I'll fight you on social media. But, ultimately it's your decision. It's your game. But I think that you owe it to yourself and to your peers in the field to figure out, you know, what is the bare minimum that you're willing to put in? Because for as much as all the naysayers and gatekeepers like to talk about how From Software doesn't include any accessibility, there sure are some things like captioning and those things which are also accessibility. So, I think it's not that developers ever these days just don't care about disabled people. I think for whatever reason they've just decided so far not to do an option here or there, and hopefully people who are listening to your cast will be the people that say that options are a good thing.
And that's a great point to end on. So, for people listening, you've mentioned a few sites and social media already. For them right now, any other social media, I'll include a link to AbleGamers in the description for this podcast. So, anywhere else you'd like to mention, Twitter, Facebook, whatever.
We are able to be found all over the place. You can find AbleGamers on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and probably 12 softwares that haven't even been invented yet. We're always really quick to grab that name. And accessible.games. Accessible.games is the number one thing I would urge anyone listening to this podcast who is a developer to go check out, because it's free. And if you decide you want to take the course, then fantastic. It'll be another feather in your cap that you'll be a certified developer. And if you don't have it in your budget, or you're simply not interested in taking the class, at least you can check out the free resource and learn some of the information that we have to offer. And you can always find me, Steven Spohn, on Twitter.
All right, great. So, with that said, we are going to wrap things up for this week's episode. So, for everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if you'd like to follow me, I am on Twitter at GWBycer. If you'd like to join our Discord where we talk about game design and game dev topics, there should be a link to that in the description down below. If you'd like to read my latest books on game design, right now my latest book is on roguelikes, and my fourth book on horror will be due out by the end of 2021. There should be links there as well. And finally, if you are a developer or a member of the industry or in game dev who want to come on and talk about design or an upcoming project, we are always looking for a guest for these recorded or live casts. If you're interested, please get in touch. With all that said, thank you so much for tuning in. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Steve, again, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Best of luck with AbleGamers, and I'm hoping we'll be able to discuss things more in the future.
Absolutely. You take care, and good luck to everybody out there.
All right, you as well. So with that said, everyone, have a great rest of your night, and take care.